It's a funny place to be, stuck in a seemingly mundane world with an inner knowing that the universe is so much more than our mortal minds can comprehend. Yet we all have the capacity to know peace and our oneness with the wholeness of life. And through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share this possibility. I'm Ryan Kurczak, and this is the Kriya Yoga Podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to the Kriya Yoga Podcast. I'm here with a very special guest, Laurel Trujillo, who is a Center for Spiritual Enlightenment minister, the host of the Yoga Hour podcast, as well as a retired physician. Welcome, Laurel. It's wonderful to have you.
Right. It's so great to be here. It's my first time actually to be a guest on a podcast after being the host for, co-host with Yogacharya O'Brian for a number of years. So it's very fun.
Well, that'll be interesting. We'll see. We'll see how the tables are turned. So before we get into the topic that we want to discuss today, which we're going to consider, and you put this forth, the theme of the map of Kriya Yoga meditation, I'd just like to get some information about who you are as a Kriya Yoga teacher. You studied with Ellen Grace O'Brien, Yogacharya O'Brian at Center for Spiritual Awareness. How did you come to that path?
Well, I was lucky to live in San Jose, and in the same way that many people are drawn to the spiritual path, it was at a time of just really feeling like something was missing in my life and really wanting to explore that and really feeling that it was on the spiritual side of things. I was a mom. I had young children at that time, and I was just very interested in trying to find a spiritual community. And then fortunately, one of the places, I actually saw it in the yellow pages in the olden days when we actually looked in the phone book.
Wow.
And ended up showing up there. And that was in January of 2002. And so I've been studying now with Yogacharya O'Brian at Center for Spiritual Enlightenment for almost 20 years. It's 19 years now because it was in January. And just gradually got more involved there, did service on different teams, and then ended up serving on the board of directors for a number of years, was the president of the board for a couple of years, and went through my ordination, process, and was ordained in 2014. Mm-hmm. And then my main way that I have taught is through the Yoga Hour. Right. So that's been my vehicle. And we try and choose topics that are either people who know a lot about yoga, know a lot about Kriya Yoga. For example, we had Roy Eugene Davis was a guest many, many times. That was so wonderful to have him as a guest. So we could really dive more deeply into the teachings, but also just a bunch of other topics that are of interest for spiritually conscious living. So,
right. And the Yoga Hour podcast, for listeners who don't know, that is a podcast that was begun by Yogacharya O'Brian, and it is put out through Unity Radio. Is that correct?
Well, it is recorded through Unity Online Radio, but it is released in all of the podcast channels as a free podcast. It's sponsored by the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment, and then It's just available for free. And the only thing I tell people is, if you're going to look for it, make sure you do the Yoga Hour, put the in there, because if yoga is the first word, you end up with like 50 podcasts.
Right. Yeah. And with Ellen's work, Yogacharya O'Brian's work, she is a student of Roy Eugene Davis as well, and the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment. That's in San Jose, California, correct?
Yes. Of course, right now in the pandemic, all the programs are really online. There's not really much going on at the center, but yes, hopefully later on this year, there will be programs again in San Jose, California, but online. There's a lot there, and people can see that at csecenter.org is the website.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, I really am glad you mentioned the website, because, CSE is fairly well known, but a lot of people don't know that there might be a Kriya Yoga Center right on their doorstep in California. So
yeah, exactly.
It's wonderful. Good.
Yeah.
Well, the topic we wanted to cover today, that we had discussed as a theme, is looking at the Yoga Sutras, but looking at the map of Kriya Yoga meditation. So generally, what are you meaning when you're talking about this idea of a map of Kriya Yoga meditation?
Well, a couple of things. So I hope we can dive into the first few sutras from the Yoga Sutras and discuss those, because it really talks about yoga, about union, and about what that is, and what happens when our mind is not free from these chitta vrittis, which we'll discuss more in a minute. But then the other thing that's great is from the limbs of yoga, this idea of how we can interiorize our attention, and then how the process unfolds itself from concentration to meditation to samadhi to liberation. And how that is a really, to me, very powerful map that really explains what happens in meditation. And I feel personally so fortunate to have that as a guide, because we can actually see these stages as they unfold in our meditation. And I've had that experience, I'm sure you have too, where something happens and you're like, oh, now I get it. Right. now I see what they're talking about there. So it's wonderful to have this mental map that then we can fill in with our experiences, and our experiences can make more sense to us because we understand them from this deep level of the philosophy of Kriya Yoga. So that's what I want to talk about. Hope that's okay with you.
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. It's right in line with kind of the theme that we've been rolling with on the Kriya Yoga podcast recently. And you mentioned having these aha moments with, I know where that's coming from now. I think this is one of the reasons why many people, even if they study the Yoga Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita and they don't quite understand it exactly the first time, that you need to keep rereading it, because you're getting it in your mind and your consciousness. And then as you practice, it's like you start to recognize, oh, that's what that sutra means. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
Yeah. I've definitely had that experience, and again felt so grateful that it helped me make sense of what I was experiencing in meditation. Mm-hmm. It really, really helped to help me understand in a deeper way what was happening for me. I think to have studied the Yoga Sutra, have studied the Bhagavad Gita, and then to have it grounded in my own experiences. And just as you're saying, you may not understand it the first time that you look at it, but these are texts that are worthy of a lifetime of study. Mm-hmm.
So as you were discussing the idea of the first few chapters, so it sounds like we're going to look at the beginning of chapter 1 and then the beginning of chapter 3, or right around in that area.
Yeah. Well, especially the beginning, the beginning of chapter 1. And I was just grabbing Roy's book, The Science of Self-Realization, A Guide to Spiritual Practice in the Kriya Yoga Tradition, because I really like his translation of the sutras, of the Yoga Sutras. So at least at the beginning, we can start with those. So we'll start with 2. And his translation of 1.2 is, samadhi is experienced when fluctuations and changes in the meditator's awareness are restrained and pacified. So this is great, right? I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward. I was interested that he chose to translate the word, the sutra in Sanskrit is yoga chitta vritti nirodha. And so it says, it starts with yoga, but he translates yoga, of course, as samadhi, which is, of course, one of its meanings. One of the things that Yogacharya O'Brian has said that I really appreciate is all the way to yoga is yoga, all the way to it's both the practice and the goal. Right. And so this gives the sense of, yes, it's something we practice every day, but there is also a goal there of this samadhi. And then this idea about restraining these chitta vrittis. Mm-hmm. So how does he say it? Fluctuations and changes in the meditator's awareness are restrained and pacified. Mm-hmm. So this is if we're going to talk about a map, to me this is like the goal, right? We've got the end destination there, right. Which is right at the very beginning. It tells you where you're going, right? Yes. Right at the beginning, 1.2. That's where we're going. And then this is the next one. So 1.3, the seer then consciously abides in its own nature. And he says in parentheses, essence. So the seer then consciously abides in its own nature. So to me, this speaks to automaticity of this process, right? That if we can, through the practices in our daily sadhana, if we can, do those practices regularly and understand through, for example, setting things up in meditation through the Kriya Yoga pranayama, and then focusing on inner sound, and really bringing our attention back and back and back to inner sound, eventually we can get to this state where the seer abides in its own nature or essence. I mean, to me, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that lovely? It tells you where you're going. It tells you kind of like what it's going to be like when you get there.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Well, it reminds me, and I think I quote this way too often on this podcast. It reminds me of Ramana Maharshi. Roy used to tell this story that when Ramana was asked, what does it take to be enlightened? And he would say, it's really very easy. All you have to do is be still. So here we have at the beginning of the Yoga Sutras. It's really very easy.
That's right. Very easy. So simple.
Yeah, in the fluctuations and changes, and you've got it.
Right. So then, to me, the other piece that's really important to understand is 1.4, which is at other times, one is inclined to identify with the changes and transformations that occur in the mind and awareness. And again, is this so beautiful? So when our mind, the chitta is full of these vrittis, these modifications, these mental modifications, we tend to identify with those changes and modifications in the mental field.
Right.
When we go through this process in meditation of returning our attention again and again, which we'll talk about in a minute, that process of interiorization and focus, we can get to this state of cessation, which is then, he talks about samadhi is experienced. And then we consciously abide in our own nature, which to me is that's like the magic of it, right? Because there's that point at which you realize, I think, looking back many, many years, coming onto the path, I think all of us, certainly I really identified myself. That's who I was what I was thinking, I was really identified with that. And then through meditation to develop this witness consciousness and to realize, no, I'm not my thoughts. Because if I were my thoughts, well, which one would that be, right? They change. They change all the time. So, or if I was my body, which body would that be? Was it when I was 7 or 14 or, 50? It's like, which of the many bodies I've had would be the body that is me? And so you realize that there's something about your essential nature that is this witness consciousness, and that that when we can get into that state, we can abide. The seer can abide in its own true nature or essence. And so those right there pack a lot to me, right? Those few sutras right at the beginning really tell us where we're going, tell us a lot about what it's going to be like when we get there. And then when we're not there, what our mental state is like.
Right. And so you've mentioned how that you have nearly 2 decades of practice with this. So I guess my question to you would be, when you first started, say, reading the Yoga Sutras or trying to get a handle on what was being shared there, how did you approach it in the beginning? And maybe how has that changed over time?
Well, I would say it was all Greek to me at the beginning. Really,
or Sanskrit.
I didn't really. Yes, right. Oh, yeah, Sanskrit, even better. No, I would read these, and I guess there was a glimmer of understanding, but it was really more. I guess it was more of like an intrigue. It was very interesting to me to think about. Oh, okay, so there is an essence, and I, in my normal consciousness, don't reside in that. And that was a really new thought, that was not me, that took me a while. And then I would say just over time, gradually through experiences in meditation, through, retreats and classes and all of that, I gradually understood it at a deeper level, which is why I wanted to talk about it with you today.
Yeah. And I liked how you pointed out a little earlier, your thoughts. And if you are your thoughts, well, which one of them are you? it makes perfect sense when you describe it that way. Or your body. Well, I was a child and then I was an adult, and well, which of those bodies am I really? And so I think that kind of awareness starts to develop when you recognize that even that your thoughts, those are fluctuations and changes. And your body, the sense of your body, is kind of also it's also fluctuating and changing. So therefore, is not you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's funny as I age, because I almost feel like it's even more apparent to me now that I'm aging, that I look in the mirror sometimes and I'm surprised that I look as old as I am, because I don't feel that. I don't feel that on the inside. I think a lot of us have that experience. You're probably too young to have gone through this yet, this disconnect. It's like, oh, really, man, I'm getting up there. I'm getting old and my body is definitely changing, but it doesn't, the me that's inside has not changed. And
right.
So that's that disconnect of, wow, this body is aging, and it doesn't, my mental image doesn't go along with that anymore. So
Mr. Davis would say that often too, though. I can remember him at retreats. He would say, well, if you really think about it, he said, I'm in my 70s and 80s at the time. He says, but I really don't feel any different inside than I did when I was younger. And if you pay attention, you don't really notice what's going on until maybe you look in the mirror and you just happen to see a picture of yourself 20 years ago. Then you think, how did that happen?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's shocking.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it helps you make peace with things, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So after those first three sutras, what I wanted to talk about is this, the other part of what I consider the map, which is the last three limbs of the 8 limbs. Well, I guess maybe the last 4, so this process of pratyahara, this process of interiorization, which of course there's so many ways, so many techniques that we have that can turn our attention within. So that's the beginning of it, is pratyahara, but then concentration.
Right.
And so this idea of concentration, well, first of all, the value of this map to me is it explains so much about the process of meditation that is not useful just to people in the Kriya Yoga tradition. But I think, like, for example, there's a lot of people who are doing Vipassana meditation right now. And so there's a lot of present moment awareness, really focusing on the breath. And every time you are distracted, continuing to focus on the breath. So that's dharana. That's the process of concentration. And so this process that we're talking about, it is describing something bigger,
right,
than just the Kriya Yoga path. And I think that understanding that process would be valuable for anybody who meditates, really, to have heard about it. So I wanted to talk about the concentration process, and then how it's an automatic process. Then once you concentrate. In this case, I'm talking about focusing. What I use as a focal point is the inner sound. So coming back to inner sound, and of course we get distracted, and you realize you're thinking about what you're going to have for breakfast or whatever, what you're going to do later today, and then you realize, I'm not focusing on what I want to focus on. So bringing it back to inner sound, bringing it back to inner sound, bringing it back to inner sound, bringing it back to inner sound. And at a certain point, that's so interesting. And Yogacharya O'Brian has taught me that we can actually see this point. It turns into meditation. So concentration flows into meditation by itself. So first I should say, the automaticity that I'm talking about, this thing that happens by itself, I think early on in meditation, I thought I needed to do something consciously. But what we're talking about is super consciousness. You're talking about something that is beyond conscious thought. And so you cannot get there through conscious thought. And that blows your mind.
It did.
especially when you are thinking about yourself as your thoughts. and then wanting to try and get your thoughts to bring you to a certain place that they can't bring you, because again, it's beyond thought. So how does that happen? Again, thank God it's natural, right? We don't have to do it. It just happens where we continue to focus and focus and focus. And then it flows into meditation. And I love the description of meditation as that state in which our attention and awareness is then drawn to the object that we are focusing on, to the object of our, to whatever we're concentrating on. It just begins to flow. And if you are looking for it, you can actually see that play. You can actually catch it when it happens, when all of a sudden you are, you're fighting, you're bringing your attention back, you're concentrating, and then it starts to flow. You can actually feel that. So that's a really cool thing to look for when you're meditating. And I did want to mention one of the images that I got from Yogacharya O'Brian. I'm not sure, she may have gotten it from Mr. Davis, but at any rate, she described the process of concentration as like a stream of water that's coming out of a faucet. And so there are these little droplets of water that are flinging off to the side. And when I am in that place, trying to, again, bring myself back, I have like a physical experience of how it's like a stream of water with these droplets that are spinning off. And then when it switches to meditation, the description is then it becomes like a stream of oil. So all of a sudden it's smooth, there's this smoothness to it where you don't have these drops, like you do when the water in a faucet that are kind of flinging off. There's this smooth flow of this oil. And that also was a helpful image to me when I was first experiencing these different states.
Right.
So,
and the automatic part, I hear what you're saying, and I think I get the idea, but it does flow naturally once it gets going, but getting to that is not necessarily automatic.
No, that's the effort. You have to put the effort in to continue to focus, and that's the concentration part.
Right.
That's the dharana before it gets to the dhyana, where it does start to flow. And then the other thing that's so interesting to me is, because again, we cannot do it consciously, we cannot do it with our conscious mind, is it happens automatically. So it's like the grace of God, right? That happens. And sometimes it's this wonderful meditation and you get into this, is described as a samadhi state where there is a merging, with the object, where you feel like you are the sound, where you are the inner sound. And of course, it doesn't happen all the time. Right. But then I can recognize it when it does. It's like, okay, so that happened. And again, It's not something that happened because I intended it to happen or wanted it to happen. The only way it happens is by itself. And so that's part of the letting go of our expectations. Because if you've probably done this before, I know I have. If you're on retreat or something, you have this fantastic experience of meditation, then you sit the next time and you're like, oh, I just want that to happen again. Right. I just want to go back there. And then that thought itself is a barrier, that attachment to that state, it becomes a barrier to the deepening of your meditation beyond a certain point. So it is important to hold it very gently and not with an expectation that you're going to be able to do the same thing again.
And what I hear you saying on a different kind of level, it's as though you're putting the work in to concentrate, and there's no guarantee that the next time you concentrate is going to be the breakthrough. Right. But you just keep doing it, and eventually, all of a sudden, there it is. It's like learning a piece of music. You keep practicing, and at some point, yes, you're going to get the music, but you don't know exactly when you're going to get it.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the part that we need to bring to our daily practice, is that dedication, that steadfastness. I think you and I talked about that when you were on the yoga hour with me, which was just a couple of weeks ago, and how Mr. Davis was such a fantastic model for us in that, about his steadfastness that he had for so many years, and that he kept his steady practice going. I love the quote. I have it here on a nice picture of Yogacharya O'Brian and Mr. Davis. It says, it's from Yogananda. Let your devotion to God be like a wood fire that burns steadily for a long time, not like a straw fire that produces a bright flame, then quickly goes out. Mm-hmm. Right. So to me, that was him. He had the log fire going there.
Right. Well, you
practice.
You asked me about this on the yoga hours. Now we're going to turn the tables around here. So oftentimes when people start beginning their practice, and I see this not too often, so that's good, but oftentimes when someone starts learning, it's like there is this real enthusiasm and they want to take every class, read every book, meditate deeply, immediately for hours on end, and they're really into it. And when I see and feel that happening, they're sending me like 2 emails a day or something like that. I want to say, whoa there. And I quote what you just quoted, relax a little bit. Was it Yogananda who said, you have to want God with all your heart, but be okay if it doesn't happen like right now.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You must want to meet God like today.
Yeah.
But then if it doesn't happen, it has to be okay if it's tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Or a week from now. But anyway,
that's right.
So in your experience, participating at Center for Spiritual Enlightenment, your own practice, do you have any advice or thoughts you might give to people about the realistic work that needs to go into attention to Kriya Yoga practice or meditation, spiritual practice in general?
Yeah. Well, great question. And I would just go back to the advice that I know Mr. Davis always gave and Yogacharya O'Brian always gives, which is just steady, to have a steady practice and to keep it up. Mm-hmm. And if there's a break in your practice, to not let it be a permanent break, but to get back to it absolutely as quickly as you can. So there's not, it's not, what do I want to say? It's not like perhaps revolutionary advice. I think probably a lot of spiritual teachers would give that very same advice. And that's the trickiness of it. That's the everydayness of it that we have to incorporate. And I would come back to something that I said at the beginning. I think something that may happen for some people is at the beginning, one of the main reasons people may come to a spiritual path is because of difficulties in their own life.
Right.
And as we practice, those difficulties improve.
Right.
They tend to get better. And so they're better. And so what happens then? And I think that can be a tricky point for a lot of people because, lives are busy. Maybe especially now with the pandemic, if people have young children at home or whatever, that those few minutes to meditate it may seem to be an impossible feat. Mm-hmm. And yet that is the most important thing, is that steadiness of practice. And what the sutra that was coming to my mind was the 112, which talks about the two most important aspects or two most important things are the steadiness of practice, abhyasa, and vairagyam, which is the non-attachment that we were talking about, non-attachment to a certain result. And so that speaks to how those are the keys for continued progress. Yogacharya O'Brian talks about how at the beginning of when you first come onto the path, oftentimes you may have different confirmatory experiences of through your meditation practice, and that oftentimes it doesn't take too long for those things to happen, for you to have some pretty profound insights. And then there's this long period of time where you're working through all kinds of stuff is coming up, especially for those of us who are householders on this path, which one of the things I love about our lineage is that it has a lot of householders in it. And so as a householder myself, as not someone who chose to, leave life and go into a monastery somewhere, it's very reassuring to me that, for example, Lahiri Mahashaya was a householder, and Roy Eugene Davis is a householder, and Yogacharya O'Brian is a householder. And so it is a confirmation that we can do it. We can do it from this point of view. And that's that thing about steady practice is I don't know, from my own experience. And I would say my own experience when I have had steady practice of meditation versus the times that I have not had a steady practice of meditation. We can run our own little study about that in our own lives. We can notice these things, a part of the self-study, right? When you realize it's like, oh my gosh, I'm having a hard time with this thing that wouldn't have normally bothered me. Like, what's going on? Mm-hmm. And then I say, aha. Oh, I have not been as regular in my practice.
Well, you brought up an interesting point, which I never really think of too often, but you mentioned that once you begin practicing and, taking, for example, the yamas and niyamas seriously, that some of the difficulties in your life may resolve themselves. And that's why a lot of people come to practice. And so then once they resolve themselves and a person feels somewhat content, I mean, do you get the sense that might be a reason for them to kind of back off a little bit every now and then because they think, well, it's okay, so I don't need to do it anymore?
Well, yeah. I mean, especially if that's why you came to the path and then that changes. I think that's kind of human nature. And I mean, we know how distracting life is.
Yeah.
We know how much we can get distracted, even at the best of times, Mm-hmm. And I would say a pandemic is not the best of times if you have young children at home or what have you, that it's very, very challenging. And yet knowing that you want it to be, having that in your heart, that you want it to be, that you want to be a wood fire, you want your devotion to your practice to be a wood fire and not to be the flash in the pan kind of things can definitely bring you back and help you rededicate yourself to your practice.
Right. So again, I don't want to get too far off topic here, but this discussion brought up a question that I get asked a lot that I don't have enough experience to respond to. So I want to send it your way. Okay.
Okay.
Just to see what you have to say. Well, you could probably consider me a householder because I have pets and bills to pay and all those types of things. I've never had children. And so often I get asked the question, we just had a child, or I've got a 2-year-old to take care of, and family in that regard. What do I do? And I just scratch my head and I say, got me. I don't know. I've never had to deal with that. I just try to meditate when they're asleep. That's what I say. So from your experience, I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on that you might be able to offer people who are dealing with family or beginning a family, but still want to remain sincere and dedicated and get that wood fire burning?
Yes, absolutely. So first, I would say, I would echo your advice of if you can find a time, even a short time, even if you can do 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I think that's very helpful. If you can do it at the same time of day, if you can get up that maybe 10 or 15 minutes early and have that little just slice of time to yourself before the hordes descend as the day goes on, that is a lovely thing to do and also can be difficult. If there's a way that you could bring some sense of holiness into your day, that can also just be really helpful. So even to have a minute, if you have a little altar, if you have a little candle somewhere in your house, maybe you have a picture of a spiritual teacher who is very meaningful to you, or a beautiful scene of nature or something like that. If you can just even take that moment, lighting that candle, even if it's just for a minute, even if you don't have time to meditate, that can be a lovely practice. Something to make you aware that there's something of your connection to what is beyond your day, right? Which is going to get swept away. If you have young children, it's just going to get swept away like crazy. Yeah. So setting aside some kind of time to do some little something can be really, really helpful, and not feeling bad about that, And then just realize that we're so blessed with yoga because there are paths of yoga. I mean, our path is pretty heavy. Kriya Yoga is pretty heavy into the Raja Yoga part, the meditation technique, etc. But there's selfless service. There's Karma Yoga. There's Bhakti Yoga. And if you can view your service to your family, to your young children through that lens, that can be a really helpful thing as well. Realize that you're not missing out, from that. There was a lovely story that I read. I had a guest on the Yoga Hour who was Sean Murphy, who wrote a lovely book about Zen. He's a Zen Roshi, and he had a story in that book. It's the story of how Zen came to America. So some lovely stories in his book, One Bird, One Stone. And he talks about this other, Zen priest who was at a retreat with his wife, and they had young children, and he was outside. All he wanted to be doing was meditating, and yet it was his time to not meditate. His wife was in the meditation hall meditating. He was out with the children, and all of a sudden it struck him that what he was doing was equally a doorway to enlightenment through his service of his young children. He was describing how he had them in a wheelbarrow, mostly because when they were done eating, then he could just take them out of the wheelbarrow and hose the wheelbarrow down.
That's good.
But, that was a key realization for him, is that he didn't need to, he was living the teachings that they were talking about in the Dojang. And so much of our experience of something that we have to do is conditioned on how we approach it. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And if we can approach it as though this is equally valid part of my spiritual path, I am providing selfless service, or bhakti yoga, I am interacting with this other embodied bit of divinity. Right. And of course, that can be really challenging when your kids are acting up. But if that can be your goal, that's an equal path. That's an equal path too. So that's the main thing, I think, is letting go of wishing that it were different, and really just being in the present, and being in the present, which is with as much grace as we can.
Mm-hmm. That reminded me of two things. Number one, what Yogananda had said to Roy, which was read a little, meditate more, and think of God all the time. Right. And you can do that at any time. And it reminded me of a follow-up story. I don't know where I heard this. I don't think Roy told it, but there's a story of this priest that lived in an apartment building, and across the street, he could see a prostitute who lived across the way. And he kept looking out the window and thinking, that's so disgusting, sex this and negativity that. Whereas the woman kept looking across the way and seeing him and thinking, geez, I wish I had time to pray and be like that. And so he ended up going to hell, and she ended up going to heaven, because the whole time that she was alive, she was thinking about devotional things and how wonderful it would be to do that. And he was thinking about sin and difficulty. So where your mind is might have a profound influence on your inner states of consciousness.
Yeah, indeed.
So anyway, let's go ahead and return back to the theme. So we were talking about, and thank you for that, by the way. I think that really helps out a lot, that description that you gave. But let's return to the idea of those limbs of yoga, and like, for example, pratyahara or internalization of attention. That precedes concentration, but that is also something that one has to work on. So in your experience, what are some good and effective ways that you have found to begin to train yourself to be able to go within and let go of some of those external distractions?
Right. So for me, mantra is a great practice, and I've worked with different mantras at different periods of time. I would say this is something I've experienced more this year. There was a New Year's retreat that I went to that encouraged us to have a mantra practice for 40 days, I think it was, and then I realized how I really like it at the beginning of my meditation practice, is to work with a mantra for. It doesn't have to be like, I don't always do the traditional 108. I have a mala. I don't always do the 108, but I often do half of a mala. So I do 54 repetitions of a mantra. And that is a beautiful thing it's been a lovely addition to my practice. Before then I do the Kriya Pranayam, and then listen to inner sound, and the meditation proceeds from there. So that is lovely. And I have worked with different ones. What I'm working with right now is Om Namah Shivaya. So it's a nice one. It could even just be something simple. It could even, with every breath, it could just be, breathing in Om and breathing out peace. It could be something that's meaningful, for you. So any of those are really lovely practice.
Right. And I like the way that you're describing this in the sense of maybe the Yoga Sutras being a map of the process, because, for example, the yamas and niyamas, well, that is just as important, getting us to being able to internalize our awareness. Because let's, for example, take the idea of non-attachment and contentment. Well, if you can take 10 to 20 minutes of your meditation to actually be content, I mean, really just decide for that time that you're fine. And then you have the capacity, or you practice letting go of all the stuff that comes into your mind that pulls you away. Well, that's practicing part of the yamas and niyamas, so that when you do go to do pratyahara or concentration, that it's easier, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. And what I love about the yamas and niyamas is it really underlines how we can't expect to have our meditation be really separate from our life. That doesn't work. We can't only work on it when we're on the mat or the cushion or in the chair when we're meditating. That it really brings it into our life in this wonderful way, right? I just feel so lucky that we have all these teachings to rely on, that we know what to practice. So we know we can practice the yamas, harmlessness, truthfulness. They're just really lovely. And there's something, they get deeper the more that I work with them. So as I mentioned, I've spent almost 20 years now with Yogacharya O'Brian. And man, there's new stuff all the time, isn't there? Mm-hmm. Isn't there? I don't know. I feel like there is in yoga. There's always something new that you can see in these practices. They're very deep. Okay. And so it really gets you out of this idea that I'm going to just meditate really hard. That's all I need to do. And then I can just kind of like let it go. And realize that, no, you have to bring it into your life and see it. The self-study part is seeing it deeper and deeper and deeper, in as many situations as you can, as many situations as we find ourselves in, as many ways that our karma comes back on us, right?
Right.
Where something happens in our life that's very unsettling. And there's always something that I can see if I look back at the Kriya Yoga teachings. There's always something for me there that helps, right? No matter what the issue is. So,
and you keep referring to self-study, and for those many people who know about Kriya Yoga already understand this, but the one of the descriptions of Kriya Yoga in chapter 2 of the Yoga Sutras is that Kriya Yoga is intensity in spiritual practice, self-study, as well as surrender in God. And so could you elaborate a little bit more on this idea of self-study so people have some better understanding about it?
Well, sure. So obviously one of the really key practices of Kriya Yoga, the three that Patanjali lists are very interrelated. Mm-hmm. And so just to give a little bit of juice to the first, which is tapas or self-discipline, it was always interesting to me that came first, that self-discipline came first. And I love the word tapas because it has to do, I don't exactly know the root in Sanskrit, but it has to do with fire, with burning. And that was always very meaningful to me in my practice of it, because, for example, I would be somewhere and I would, for example, be tempted to gossip about something that I knew it wasn't something that I really should say or really wanted to say, deeply. But there was a little part of me that wanted to just share that whatever little bit of morsel of gossip that I had. And so the not sharing of it, if anybody's gone through this, you really feel it's like, I get why they called it tapas. I get why there's a burning that's associated with it. Hurts.
It hurts a little bit.
It really, it's like there's a friction there. There's a heat, it's like part of you wants to say it. And the other part's like, no, I'm not going to say it. No, I'm not going to say it. No, I'm not going to say it, and that's the,
right.
It's like the two sticks rubbing together there. That's creating some heat.
That's wonderful. I mean, the way you describe that, it's like that dissonance. It's like the dissonance that comes up. That's something moving one way, something moving another way, and your intensity or your tapas, your practice is to keep doing it until you finally overcome it. That's a good way to think about it. I like that.
Right. And it does get easier. It really does get easier, but especially at first, there's a lot of burning. You're putting the brakes on, and that's generating a lot of heat, right?
Right.
So then self-discipline. So self-study. Self-study is really interesting to me because it's very broad. So self-study is obviously studying ourselves. In fact, even noticing this process of tapas, that's part of that. It's why they're related to each other. You can see this process within yourself. And then study also has to do with studying the nature of consciousness. So studying our own consciousness and seeing when these things come up for us, that's part of it, but also reading. So, for example, all of the wonderful books that Mr. Davis left us, wonderful practice to be able to use that, refer to those books. So there's this, the self-discipline, self-study, which involves those two things that I mentioned, at least. That's all that comes to my mind. Maybe you have other things to add to it, but to me, it's study of the nature of consciousness as well as study of ourselves in any situation. And that includes, by the way, getting triggered. Anytime I get triggered, and especially if I have to say, I do need to have a regular meditation practice, because if I get triggered and I'm into it, like, how you get angry or whatever, you can also just be gone, where it happens too quickly, and before you know it, you're really upset and angry, and you're responding. Or you're reacting. It's like the knee jerk. You're just reacting to it. But when I have an active meditation practice, it does open up this space that where something will happen to me, and I can stay in witness consciousness long enough to be able to see, something just happened. Like, my pulse is really, speeded up. I'm feeling something. I'm feeling afraid. I'm feeling anxious, whatever it is. That's a wonderful time for self-study and think, wow, what was that?
Exactly.
What the heck was that?
Yeah.
So that's self-study. And then the last one is surrender. Surrender, Ishvara Pranidhan. So surrender to God. So this feeling like everything's going to be okay, which getting back to, I think, another thing we might have talked about on my podcast, one of my favorite of the verses of the Bhagavad Gita is 240, which talks about even a little bit of this practice, which to me is the practice of yoga. A little bit of this practice removes great fear. And that has been something that has been very, very helpful to me to reflect on, and has been true in my life, where we can get stuck in our ego consciousness. We can get stuck there. And that's the point where I am when I am feeling afraid or anxious or whatever. And then when we can relax into our wholeness and relax into the oneness that we can have experience of in the deepest part of meditation, if we can bring that state of mind back, it does allow us to let go in this beautiful way that makes everything better.
Right.
if we can get there, it really makes everything better. And to me, that's what they're talking about in that 240 of the Bhagavad Gita. Even a little bit of this practice will remove great fear. So.
Well, if you catch a glimpse, as the purpose and direction of meditation is to catch a glimpse as that witness, where you recognize, as you said earlier, that, of these thoughts, which one am I? Well, I'm not any of them. Or of the body, which of these bodies am I? I'm not any of them. If you catch a glimpse of that, then yes, in your mind or in your experience, the next time a worry comes up around a thought or an issue of your body, you're maybe going to be less likely to get pulled into it, because you've experienced at least a few times, well, hey, wait a minute, I'm actually not this thing. Right?
Yeah. And it's just, to me, getting back to those first few verses of the Yoga Sutras that we were just talking about, you can realize, I am in that state of mind where I am identifying with these different states of consciousness.
Right.
I am identifying with my body. I'm identifying with my mind, and then realizing, there's a different state of consciousness that I can identify with. My true nature, my essence of being is not that. And that is so lovely to have that experience in meditation and be able to call it up and remember it and hold on to it. There's such beautiful quotes from various mystics. I think was it Julian of Norwich that, talked about all this is full. all that is full. When fullness comes from fullness, fullness remains. And if you've had that experience in meditation, you've felt what that feels like, that wholeness, that is our essence of being, and that we can experience, that we can get back to. And that definitely removes great fear.
Yeah. Yes. I don't even know what else to say beyond that. But the idea of self-study, that's, as you mentioned, that's paying attention to not just the nature of consciousness, but also our own unique temperament. Because if we can understand our own unique temperament, then we can also understand, as you mentioned, triggers that we have, how we relate to things. And once you start to get a glimpse of that, you're less likely to go into an unconscious state, to get too caught up in it. I had a friend recently of African American descent, and he got profiled and pulled over here in the lovely land to where I live, and he was accused of something that he obviously did not do, and they were anyway. It was a difficult situation, but he remained calm, and he was still upset, but. If we think about it, he's been a meditator for a while. And if he had not had the ability to know what his triggers are, to know what difficulties there might be if he expressed what he wanted to express, there would have been more trouble there. So right. In that experience of self-study, even though it's, we can't change society that quickly, we're trying, on an individual level, it can even benefit us even when we come up against difficulty or unfairness or adversity on some level, by learning to know what we are and manage our responses, master our consciousness in that way. Still, there's a benefit there. There's something good to know there. So it's practical and mundane, as well as much larger picture too. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it was my good fortune, as I mentioned, to serve on the board of directors at the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment. And one of the things that was really wonderful to see was to see the teachings brought to life in situation after situation. So something would come up and the board would have to talk about, well, what do we do? And then to turn back for guidance to, for example, the yamas and the niyamas, right. And really see, oh, those apply here. Oh, those apply here. And it was actually very powerful to realize how these teachings are infinitely adaptable,
right?
And is so much there, so they can add so much richness to our life, right. And just feel a gratitude, right? Gratitude to my teacher Yogacharya O'Brian, to her teacher Roy Eugene Davis, to Yogananda, to the rest of the lineage that brought these teachings forward so that they are accessible to us. We are so blessed.
Yes. And we're coming near the end of our time together. But do you have any final thoughts or ideas you'd like to share with listeners about this idea of the map of Kriya Yoga meditation or practice in general?
Well, I would say one thing that we haven't talked about, which for some reason I was flashing on, was this idea of sattvic life. Okay. So this idea of there are these three gunas that are, everything in creation is made up of these, and sattva is the one that is it's light and uplifting, this uplifting energy that we can access, and that it can be really helpful to think about that and think about ways in your life that you can bring that in. So for example, being outside in nature is one of the really easy ways to do that, because there's a lot of sattvic energy in nature. And so if you're having a dark day, if it's a time that you're struggling, see if there's a way that you can get outside. And obviously, food also can. Sattvic food is food that's very close to its natural essence. So have a piece of fruit, go on a walk, do something to bring your energy more into a sattvic space, and that will really benefit you. And then it will be easier to do the other things we've been talking about, to have a regular meditation practice, etc.
Right. That reminds me again of someone asked Ramana Maharshi what is one of the greatest aids to the spiritual path, and he said of all things, the one he focused on, he said a sattvic diet. A light and healthy diet is best for the mind to allow you to do this well. So anyway, well, I want to thank you so much for being here today. It was really a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, well, same here. Thanks for asking me on your podcast. I really enjoyed it, Ryan. I hope your listeners enjoy it as well, and hope that maybe they come and check out the Yoga Hour.
Yes, the Yoga Hour, and I will put a link to that in the description of this podcast. Those of you can go check it out. And was there 10 years worth of podcast material on there? Is that correct?
Over 10 years. That's right. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff out there, including, by the way, Roy. Lots of great conversations with Roy. So you can, if you find it on any of the podcast apps, you can just put Roy Eugene Davis in there and a bunch of episodes will come up. In fact, he was on the Yoga Hour on a Thursday, the week before he passed. So it was like the last week of his life, and he was on the podcast. And I cannot tell you how shocked I was to find that he had passed just less than a week later, because he was just himself. He was just totally amazingly present and had such great teachings. So excellent.
So we will direct him to the Yoga Hour podcast with the V in there. But anyway, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to being in touch soon.
Sounds good, Ryan.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye.
This episode of the Kriya Yoga Podcast was made possible by donations from Kriya Yoga Apprenticeship students and supporters of our Patreon community at www.patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.